The evening air was cold, and the streets were crowded with people rushing to their homes or stopping to enjoy dinner after a long day. Bright lights from shops and restaurants filled the area, making the street look lively and warm. In the middle of that busy place stood a small restaurant that was known for its good food and soft piano music that played every night. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was comfortable and cheerful. People sat at wooden tables, talking and laughing while enjoying their meals. Plates clinked softly, glasses touched, and the smell of warm food filled the room. In the corner of the restaurant stood a beautiful black piano. It was polished so well that the light above reflected on its smooth surface. Guests often liked that piano because it made the place feel special. Sometimes a musician came in the evening and played soft melodies while people ate. It made the restaurant feel calm and elegant. But outside that warm place, the world looked very different for one young girl. She stood across the street, watching the restaurant through the glass window. Her clothes were old and worn, and the cold air made her pull her thin jacket closer around herself. Her hair was slightly messy from the wind, and her shoes looked like they had walked many long roads. The girl had been wandering through the streets for most of the day. She had not eaten anything since morning. At first, she tried to ignore the hunger in her stomach, but as the hours passed, the feeling became stronger. Every time she walked past a food stall or restaurant, the smell of food made her stomach tighten. She was used to people ignoring her. When someone looks like they belong to the streets, most people simply walk past without noticing. Some people feel sorry, some feel uncomfortable, and others pretend not to see anything at all. But that evening felt different. As she stood outside the restaurant, her eyes slowly moved toward the piano inside. The instrument looked familiar to her. Even from outside the glass window, she could recognize its shape and the way the keys were arranged. For a few seconds, she forgot about the cold air and the busy street around her. She just looked at the piano. Something in her expression changed. It was almost like seeing an old memory suddenly come alive. Inside the restaurant, people were busy enjoying their meals, completely unaware that someone outside was watching so carefully. A group of friends laughed loudly near the window, while a couple sitting near the corner quietly talked over dinner. The piano sat quietly, waiting. The girl stood there for a long moment thinking. She looked down at her hands for a second. Her fingers were slightly cold, and the skin showed signs of rough days spent outside. But she slowly moved them as if remembering something. A small thought entered her mind. First, she tried to push it away. But the more she looked at the piano, the stronger the thought became. Her stomach tightened again with hunger. She knew she needed food, but she also knew that asking people directly rarely worked. Most of the time, people just shook their heads and walked away. She looked at the restaurant door again. It opened and closed as customers came and went. Warm light spilled onto the sidewalk every time someone entered or left. The girl took a slow breath. Her heart began beating faster. She wasn't sure if the idea in her mind was brave or foolish. But at that moment, hunger and hope mixed together in a strange way. After standing there for another minute, she slowly walked toward the door. Each step felt heavy, as if she wasn't sure whether she should turn back or continue forward. When she finally reached the entrance, she hesitated. Through the glass, she could see people sitting comfortably at their tables. Their clothes were neat and clean, their plates full of food. The place looked so different from the street outside. For someone like her, walking into a place like that was not easy. But the thought of the piano gave her courage. She quietly pushed the door open. A small bell above the door made a soft sound as she stepped inside. The warm air from the restaurant immediately surrounded her, replacing the cold wind outside. The smell of fresh bread, soup, and cooked food filled the room, making her realize just how hungry she really was. At first, nobody noticed her. The restaurant was busy, and people were focused on their conversations. A waiter walked past carrying a tray of drinks. Someone near the back laughed loudly at a joke. But after a few seconds, a couple of customers near the entrance began to notice her. Their eyes moved from her worn clothes to her tired face. One person looked confused. Another raised an eyebrow slightly. The girl stood quietly near the door, unsure where to go next. She didn't want to disturb anyone, but she also knew she couldn't just stand there forever. So she slowly walked a few steps forward. More people began to notice her presence. Conversations at nearby tables became quieter as curious glances moved in her direction. Some people thought she might be lost. Others assumed she had walked into the wrong place. The girl finally stopped near the middle of the restaurant, where several tables were filled with guests enjoying their meals. For a moment, she simply stood there, trying to gather the courage to speak. Her heart beat loudly in her chest. She could feel many eyes watching her now, but she reminded herself why she had come inside. Taking a small breath, she looked toward one of the tables where a group of people were sitting together. They appeared relaxed and cheerful, finishing their meals while chatting casually. The girl stepped closer. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but clear. "Can I play the piano for a piece of meal?" For a second, the entire table went silent. The people sitting there stared at her, unsure if they had heard correctly. One person blinked in surprise. Another leaned back slightly in their chair. The question hung in the air, unexpected and unusual. The girl didn't say anything else. She simply stood there, waiting. A few nearby customers had overheard her words, and they began turning their heads toward the scene. Someone at another table whispered something to a friend. The piano in the corner of the restaurant remained still, reflecting the soft light above it. It looked elegant and important, almost too perfect for someone like the girl standing there. For a moment, the restaurant felt strangely quiet. Then suddenly, someone at the table let out a small laugh. Another person chuckled, shaking their head in disbelief. Within seconds, the quiet room began filling with amused reactions. Some people smiled as if they thought it was a strange joke. Others looked at the girl with curiosity, wondering what had made her say something like that. The girl didn't react to the laughter. She kept her eyes calm and her posture steady. Her gaze slowly moved toward the piano. In that moment, nobody in the restaurant could imagine that the simple request they had just heard was about to turn the entire evening into something unforgettable. The small laugh that started at one table quickly spread to the others. At first it was only a few quiet chuckles, but soon several people in the restaurant were smiling or whispering to the person next to them. The girl stood still in the middle of the room, her eyes calm, even though the reaction around her was growing louder. Some customers leaned back in their chairs, clearly amused by what they had just heard. One man lifted his glass and said in a joking tone, "Did she say she wants to play the piano?" His friends laughed softly, shaking their heads as if the idea sounded impossible. Another person near the window looked toward the piano and then back at the girl. The contrast between the two seemed almost strange. The piano looked expensive and elegant, something that belonged in a concert hall. The girl, on the other hand, looked tired and worn from long days outside. Because of that difference, most people immediately assumed the same thing. They thought she couldn't possibly know how to play. A few customers simply returned to their meals, treating the moment as nothing more than a short interruption. Others watched with curiosity, wondering how the situation would end. The girl didn't move. Her hands were relaxed by her sides, and her expression remained quiet and patient. One person at the table she had spoken to leaned forward slightly. "You want to play that piano?" the person asked again, pointing toward the corner of the restaurant. The girl nodded once. "For food," the person added. Again she nodded. This time a louder laugh came from another table. Someone whispered, "Maybe she thinks it's easy." Another voice said jokingly, "Maybe she'll play one note and run away with the bread." More soft laughter followed. The girl heard every word, but she didn't react. She had heard worse things before. Living on the streets meant learning how to stay calm even when people looked at you with doubt. Across the room, a waiter paused for a moment while holding a tray. The waiter glanced toward the manager standing near the counter, silently asking what should happen next. The manager had also heard the girl's request. From where he stood, he watched the scene carefully. At first he wasn't sure if the girl was serious or if she was simply trying to get attention. The restaurant was busy that evening, and situations like this could sometimes create problems. But the girl wasn't causing trouble. She wasn't shouting or begging loudly. She had only asked one question. And now she was standing there quietly. The manager slowly walked a few steps closer, observing the reactions of the customers. Some people were smiling. Others looked curious. One customer near the piano turned in the chair to look directly at the girl. "Do you even know how to play?" the person asked, raising an eyebrow. The question hung in the air. The girl didn't answer with a long explanation. She simply said, "Yes." Her voice was soft, but it carried enough confidence to make a few people stop smiling. Still, most customers continued to treat the moment like entertainment. A man sitting near the middle table crossed his arms and said jokingly, "Let her try. It might be funny." A few others nodded, amused by the idea. Someone else said, "Yes, let's hear the performance." The tone of their voices made it clear that they were not expecting anything serious. They were expecting a mistake, a few wrong notes, maybe even an awkward moment that would make the room laugh again. But the girl didn't look embarrassed. Instead, she slowly turned her head and looked at the piano again. The instrument stood quietly in the corner, shining under the warm lights. The black surface reflected the room like a mirror. The keys were perfectly lined up, untouched for the evening. For the girl, that piano was not just decoration. It was something familiar, something important. Back near the entrance, another waiter whispered to a coworker, "Do you think she really knows how to play?" The coworker shrugged. "Probably not." But both of them kept watching. The manager finally stepped forward until he was close enough to speak directly to the girl. "You said you want to play the piano," he said calmly. The girl nodded again. "And you want food in return?" "Yes," she replied. The manager looked at her carefully. Her face showed no sign of joking. She wasn't smiling nervously or trying to convince anyone with big promises. She simply looked honest. Still, the situation felt unusual. One of the customers nearby leaned toward the manager and said with a grin, "Come on, let her try. We could use some entertainment tonight." A few people laughed again. The manager looked around the room for a moment. The guests didn't seem annoyed. In fact, many of them looked curious now. Sometimes unexpected moments like this made the evening more memorable. He turned back toward the girl. "Do you really know how to play?" he asked once more. The girl gave the same quiet answer. "Yes." Her confidence made the manager pause for a second. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way she spoke didn't sound like a guess. Still, the customers were waiting. The room had grown strangely quiet again as people watched to see what would happen. Finally, the manager sighed softly and gave a small nod. "You can try," he said. A few people clapped jokingly. Someone near the back of the restaurant laughed and said, "This should be interesting." But the girl didn't react to the comments. She simply looked toward the piano. For a moment, she remained standing where she was, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she began walking slowly toward the corner of the restaurant. Every step she took seemed to draw more attention. Forks stopped moving. Conversations faded. Even the kitchen noise in the background seemed quieter as people focused on the unusual scene. A couple sitting near the piano moved their chairs slightly to give her space. One of them whispered, "I can't believe this is happening." Another customer pulled out a phone, ready to record what they expected to be a funny moment. The girl finally reached the piano bench. She stood beside it for a second, looking at the instrument closely. Up close, the piano looked even more beautiful. The keys were clean and smooth. The wood carried a faint smell of polish. For a brief moment, the girl placed her hand gently on the edge of the piano. Her fingers rested there as if greeting an old friend. Behind her, the restaurant had become almost completely silent now. The laughter had faded. Curiosity had replaced it. People leaned forward slightly in their chairs, waiting to see what would happen next. Some still believed she would press a few random notes and walk away. Others simply wanted to see how the moment would end. The girl slowly pulled the piano bench closer. The soft sound of the bench moving across the floor echoed quietly in the room. Then she sat down. Her feet barely touched the floor, but she adjusted herself carefully until she felt comfortable. For a moment, she didn't touch the keys. Instead, She looked at them. Row after row of black and white keys stretched in front of her. The restaurant lights reflected gently across the smooth surface. Behind her, dozens of eyes were watching, some curious, some amused, some doubtful, but the girl seemed completely calm. She slowly lifted her hands and held them above the keys. Her fingers hovered there for a second. The room was so quiet now that even the soft sound of breathing could be heard. No one laughed anymore. Everyone was waiting. In that silent moment, the entire restaurant felt like it was holding its breath, unaware that the next few seconds were about to change everything they believed about the quiet girl who had walked in asking for a simple piece of meal. The restaurant had become so quiet that even the smallest sound felt loud. The girl sat on the piano bench with her hands hovering just above the keys. Her fingers were still, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Behind her, people waited. Some leaned forward in their chairs. Others held their phones up, ready to record what they believed would be a short and awkward moment. A few guests still had small smiles on their faces, expecting a mistake at any second. But the girl didn't rush. She took a slow breath, her shoulders rising gently before relaxing again. The soft lights above the piano reflected across the black surface, making the instrument shine quietly in the corner of the room. For a moment, she closed her eyes. No one spoke. Then she opened them again and gently lowered her fingers onto the keys. The first note came softly. It was clear, smooth, and perfectly controlled. The sound floated through the restaurant like a small wave. It wasn't loud, but it carried a warmth that immediately caught people's attention. A few guests exchanged quick glances. That didn't sound like a random key. The girl pressed another note, then another. Within seconds, a simple melody began to form. It moved slowly at first, like someone telling a quiet story. The notes blended together naturally, creating a sound that felt calm and thoughtful. The man who had joked earlier about the performance slowly lowered his glass. The small smile on his face disappeared. Across the room, the person holding the phone paused the recording for a second, unsure if they had heard correctly. The girl continued playing. Her fingers moved carefully across the keys, pressing them with gentle confidence. The melody began to grow, adding new notes that made the music deeper and richer. People who had been whispering now turned fully toward the piano. Conversations stopped completely. Even the waiters standing near the kitchen door paused to watch. The sound of the piano filled the room in a way no one expected. It wasn't messy or uncertain. Every note felt deliberate, like part of something carefully practiced. The melody slowly changed, becoming more emotional, carried a quiet feeling that made the room feel different. Some guests leaned back in their chairs, listening more closely now. The girl's fingers began moving faster. They slid across the keys with a natural rhythm that looked effortless. The movement of her hands was smooth, as if she had played this piece many times before. The man near the window whispered softly, "Wait, she actually knows how to play." The person sitting beside him nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the piano. At another table, someone who had laughed earlier now sat completely still. The fork in their hand remained halfway between the plate and their mouth as they watched the performance unfold. The girl didn't look at the audience. Her eyes stayed focused on the keys in front of her. Every movement of her fingers seemed guided by memory and feeling. The music continued to grow stronger. Soft notes turned into flowing patterns that filled the entire restaurant. The melody rose and fell like gentle waves, sometimes calm and sometimes powerful. Felt alive. For many people in the room, the change in atmosphere was almost unbelievable. Just a few minutes earlier, they had been laughing at the idea of the girl playing the piano. Now no one was laughing. Instead, they listened. A waiter quietly set down a tray on the counter, careful not to make any noise. Another employee slowly walked closer to the dining area, drawn by the sound of the music. Even the manager, who had allowed the girl to try, now stood still with his arms crossed, watching carefully. He hadn't expected this. The girl's hands moved faster again, creating a beautiful rhythm that filled the air with energy. Her fingers jumped between high and low keys with perfect timing. The sound of the piano echoed softly against the restaurant walls. A couple sitting near the piano looked at each other in surprise. "She's incredible," one of them whispered. The other nodded slowly, unable to take their eyes off the performance. The girl's face remained calm, but there was a quiet focus in her expression. She leaned slightly forward as she played, as if the music was guiding her hands. For a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had disappeared for her. There was only the piano and the music. The melody suddenly shifted into a brighter section, faster and more lively. The change caught the audience by surprise, making several people sit up straighter in their chairs. A young guest near the back of the room quietly said, "This sounds like a real concert." Another person nodded in agreement. The girl's fingers moved across the keys with incredible speed now, but the notes remained clear and precise. There was no hesitation in her playing. Everything flowed naturally. The guests who had been recording earlier slowly lifted their phones again, but this time their expressions were different. There was no laughter now, only amazement. At the table near the center of the room, the same people who had first laughed at her request now watched with wide eyes. One of them leaned closer to the piano, whispering softly, "How is this possible?" No one had an answer. The music continued, filling the restaurant with emotion. The melody softened again, becoming slower and more gentle. It carried a feeling that made the room feel warm and quiet at the same time. A few guests felt a strange tightness in their chest as they listened. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something deeper, something real. The girl's fingers slowed slightly as the piece moved toward its final moments. Each note now felt more meaningful, like the closing words of a story. The restaurant remained silent. No plates moved. No glasses clinked. Every person in the room seemed completely focused on the piano. The girl pressed the final sequence of notes with careful control. The melody floated softly through the air before slowly fading away. Her fingers rested gently on the keys for a second longer. Then she lifted her hands. The last note disappeared into the quiet room. For a moment no one moved. The silence that followed felt even deeper than before. It was the kind of silence that happens when people are trying to understand something unexpected. The girl remained seated at the piano, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She didn't turn around immediately. Behind her, dozens of people stared at the instrument, still processing what they had just heard. Just minutes earlier, they had expected a joke. Instead, they had witnessed something completely different. Something none of them had imagined when the girl first walked into the restaurant asking a simple question for a piece of meal. For a few seconds after the last note faded away, the restaurant stayed completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the sound of the piano was still floating in the air, even though the music had already ended. The girl slowly lowered her hands from the keys and rested them in her lap. She sat quietly on the bench, looking down at the piano. She didn't turn around to look at the people behind her. Behind her, dozens of customers were still staring at the piano. Many of them were trying to understand what they had just heard. Only a few minutes earlier, they had been laughing at the idea of the girl playing the piano. They had expected a mistake, maybe a few random notes that would make the room laugh again. But what they had just heard was something completely different. It wasn't just music. It was something powerful and real. At one of the tables near the middle of the room, a man slowly put down his fork. His plate of food sat untouched in front of him now. He had stopped eating the moment the girl began to play. He looked at the piano, then quietly shook his head as if he couldn't believe what had happened. At another table, a couple exchanged surprised looks. "That was incredible," one of them whispered softly. The other nodded, still staring at the piano bench where the girl sat. Near the entrance, one of the waiters leaned against the wall with wide eyes. The tray he had been holding earlier was now resting on a nearby counter. He quietly said to the coworker beside him, "I didn't expect that at all." The coworker slowly shook their head in agreement. Even the manager stood still for a moment, looking toward the piano. His arms were still crossed, but his expression had completely changed. The curiosity from earlier had turned into something closer to respect. The The silence in the restaurant lasted a little longer. Then someone near the back of the room slowly began to clap. The sound of the hands coming together echoed softly in the quiet space. At first it was only one person, but within seconds, another pair of hands joined in. Then another. Soon the entire restaurant was filled with applause. The clapping grew louder and louder as people stood from their chairs. Some guests smiled warmly while others shook their heads in disbelief. The girl finally turned around on the piano bench. Her expression looked calm, but her eyes showed a small hint of surprise at the reaction in the room. She had expected people to listen, but she hadn't expected everyone to stand and clap. The applause continued for several moments. A few people even whistled in appreciation, while others nodded toward her with admiration. The same guests who had laughed earlier were now clapping just as loudly as everyone else. One of them spoke quietly to the person next to him. "I feel bad for laughing before," he admitted. The other person gave a small nod. "Me too." Near the window, someone who had been recording earlier lowered their phone slowly. "This video isn't funny at all," the person whispered. "It's amazing." The clapping eventually began to slow down, but the energy in the room felt completely different now. The girl carefully stood up from the piano bench. She didn't look proud or dramatic. She simply stood there quietly, as if she wasn't sure what to do next. The manager finally walked toward her. People nearby watched as he approached the piano. For a moment, the room became quiet again as everyone waited to hear what he would say. The manager stopped a few steps away from the girl and looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "You played that beautifully," he said. His voice was calm, but there was clear respect in his tone. The girl gave a small nod. "Thank you," she replied softly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the manager asked the question that many people in the restaurant were already wondering. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The girl hesitated. Her eyes moved briefly toward the piano keys again. The room remained quiet as people waited for her answer. "I learned a long time ago," she said. Her voice was gentle, almost shy. The manager tilted his head slightly. "From a teacher?" The girl thought for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. A few customers nearby listened carefully. The story behind her talent had suddenly become just as interesting as the performance itself. "How long have you been playing?" the manager asked. The girl looked down at her hands. "I used to practice every day," she said. Her words were simple, but the way she said them made it clear that those days were part of a different time in her life. The manager noticed the worn sleeves of her jacket and the tired look on her face. "You don't play much now?" he asked gently. The girl shook her head slightly. "Not often." A quiet feeling spread through the room. Some guests began to imagine how someone with such skill could end up walking into a restaurant just to ask for food. At one of the nearby tables, a woman looked at the girl with sympathy. "That kind of talent shouldn't be forgotten," she whispered to the person beside her. Across the room, the man who had joked earlier leaned back in his chair. "I really thought she was joking," he admitted quietly. Another guest responded, "Sometimes we think we know someone just by looking at them." The girl remained standing near the piano, unsure of what would happen next. She hadn't come to impress anyone. She had only asked for a meal. The manager seemed to remember that moment as well. He looked toward one of the waiters and nodded. "Bring her something to eat," he said. The waiter smiled slightly and walked quickly toward the kitchen. A few customers nearby immediately reacted. One person said, "Please bring a full meal." Another voice added, "And a drink too." The girl looked surprised again. She hadn't expected so much kindness from the same room that had laughed earlier. The manager noticed her reaction. "You asked to play for a piece of meal," he said gently. Then he gestured toward the restaurant. "I think you earned much more than that." Some of the customers nodded in agreement. A small smile appeared on the girl's face for the first time since she had entered the restaurant. It was a quiet smile, but it showed relief. As she stepped away from the piano, people near the front tables began clapping again. This time softer but full of appreciation. The piano remained in the corner, silent once more. But the room no longer felt the same as it had before she arrived. The laughter from earlier had disappeared. In its place was something very different. Respect. The girl stepped away from the piano slowly, still unsure how to react to everything that had just happened. A few minutes earlier she had walked into the restaurant quietly, hoping only for something small to eat. Now the entire room was looking at her with a completely different expression. The laughter from earlier had disappeared. In its place there was curiosity, respect, and something else that many people in the room felt but could not easily explain. One of the waiters returned from the kitchen carrying a tray. On the tray was a warm plate of food and a glass of water. The smell of the meal filled the air as the waiter walked toward the girl. When the plate was placed on a nearby table, the girl looked at it for a moment as if she needed a second to believe it was really for her. "Please sit," the waiter said kindly. The girl nodded quietly and sat down at the table. For a second she simply looked at the plate. The food looked warm and fresh, and the smell made her stomach tighten again with hunger. Around the restaurant, people continued watching her, but this time their attention felt different. They were no longer curious in a careless way. Instead, many of them seemed thoughtful. The girl picked up a fork and took a small bite. She ate slowly at first, as if trying not to rush, but it was clear that she had been very hungry. At the table near the center of the room, the same group of people who had laughed earlier now spoke quietly among themselves. "I really didn't expect that," one of them admitted. Another person nodded. "Neither did I. She played better than the musicians who usually perform here." The person who had joked the loudest earlier leaned back in his chair and sighed softly. "I feel a little ashamed for laughing." Across the room, someone else said, "We all judged too quickly." While these conversations happened around her, the girl continued eating quietly. She didn't seem interested in attention. She just focused on finishing the meal in front of her. The manager stood nearby for a moment, watching the scene. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed in a way he rarely saw. A place that had started the evening with casual laughter and conversation now felt thoughtful and reflective. He slowly walked toward the table where the girl was sitting. "Is the food okay?" he asked gently. The girl looked up and gave a small nod. "Yes," she said softly. "Thank you." The manager pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Earlier you said you learned to play a long time ago," he said. "Who taught you?" The girl paused for a moment before answering. Her eyes moved briefly toward the piano in the corner of the room. "Someone in my family," she said quietly. The manager waited, sensing there was more to the story. The girl took another small bite of food before continuing. "When I was younger, there was a piano in the house," she explained. "I practiced every day." Her voice carried a calm tone, but there was also a hint of something deeper, like she was remembering another time. "Did you take lessons for a long time?" the manager asked. The girl nodded slightly. "Yes." Several people sitting nearby had begun listening carefully. The story behind her talent had captured their attention. One of the customers leaned closer to hear better. The manager spoke again, keeping his voice gentle. "You play like someone who has practiced for years." The girl looked down at her hands. "I practiced whenever I could," she said. Her fingers rested quietly on the edge of the table now, the same fingers that had moved so confidently across the piano keys just minutes earlier. "What happened?" the manager asked softly. For a moment the girl did not answer. The room around them remained calm and quiet, giving her space to speak if she wanted to. Finally she gave a small shrug. "Life changed," she said simply. She didn't give many details, but the meaning behind her words was clear enough. Sometimes life moves in unexpected directions, and not everyone has control over where those paths lead. One of the customers nearby lowered their heads slightly, thinking about how easily people judge situations they don't understand. Another guest whispered quietly, "She still remembers everything." The manager nodded slowly. "You definitely didn't forget how to play," he said. A small smile appeared on the girl's face again. "I remember the music," she said. Across the room, the waiter who had first brought her food stood watching quietly. He looked toward the piano and then back at the girl. "That piano has never sounded like that before," he whispered to a coworker. The coworker smiled slightly. Maybe it was waiting for the right person. Back at the table, the girl finished the last bite of her meal and placed the fork down. She looked relieved now, as if the hunger that had been bothering her all day had finally faded. "Thank you for the food," she said politely. The manager nodded. "You earned it," he replied. A few customers nearby spoke up. "You earned much more than that," one of them said. Another guest added, "You should be playing in big halls." The girl listened quietly but didn't respond with excitement or pride. She seemed used to keeping her emotions calm. The man who had laughed earlier slowly stood up and walked toward her table. He looked slightly uncomfortable, as if he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to begin. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I want to apologize," he said. The girl looked at him with mild surprise. "I laughed when you first spoke," he continued. "I thought you were joking." The girl didn't seem upset. She simply nodded once. "It's okay," she said calmly. Her simple answer made the man pause for a moment. "I guess sometimes we think we understand people just by looking at them," he said quietly. Another guest nearby added, "Tonight proved that we don't." The girl glanced again toward the piano in the corner of the room. For a moment she seemed thoughtful, almost as if the music had reminded her of something she hadn't felt in a long time. The manager noticed the look on her face. "Do you still like playing?" he asked. The girl answered without hesitation. "Yes." The word came out quickly and honestly. That simple answer made several people in the restaurant exchange looks. It was clear that music was still very important to her. The manager leaned back slightly in his chair. "Well," he said slowly, "talent like that shouldn't be forgotten." The people nearby nodded in agreement. One guest said quietly, "The world almost missed hearing that music tonight." The girl sat silently for a moment, her eyes resting once more on the piano keys across the room. None of the people in the restaurant knew exactly what the future would hold for her. But one thing had become very clear to everyone sitting there that evening. The quiet girl who had walked in asking for a simple piece of meal was not just another stranger passing through the street. She was someone with a gift that had the power to stop an entire room, turn laughter into silence, and remind people that sometimes the greatest stories appear when we least expect them. The restaurant slowly returned to a gentle hum of quiet conversation, but the mood was still different from before. People were talking softly now, often glancing toward the girl who had just finished her meal. A short time ago she had walked in as a stranger that most people barely noticed. Now many of the guests felt as if they had witnessed something important. The girl sat calmly at the table for a moment after finishing the last bite of food. She looked more relaxed now. The tired tension that had been in her face earlier had faded a little. The manager stood nearby, thinking about everything that had happened. He had worked in the restaurant for many years, and he had seen many musicians perform at that piano. Some had been very skilled, some had been average. But the moment that had just taken place felt different. It had started with laughter, and it had ended with silence and respect. He walked back toward the girl's table again. "You don't seem in a hurry," he said gently. The girl shook her head slightly. "Not really," she replied. Outside the large window, the evening had grown darker. The streetlights were glowing now, and people continued walking past the restaurant, unaware of the moment that had just happened inside. The manager pulled out the chair across from her again. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "many musicians play here in the evenings." The girl listened quietly. "They come with instruments, sheet music, and plans for their performance," he continued. "But tonight you walked in with nothing except courage." The girl looked down at her hands again. "I only wanted food," she said softly. The manager nodded. "Yes," he said, "but you also reminded everyone here of something important." At a nearby table, a couple who had been listening to the conversation looked toward them. One of them smiled slightly and said, "That performance was the best music we've heard here." Another customer nodded in agreement. The girl seemed a little shy hearing these comments. She wasn't used to people praising her like that. She glanced once more toward the piano in the corner. The instrument looked quiet and still again, as if nothing unusual had happened. But everyone in the room knew that the piano had sounded very different tonight. One of the waiters walked over with a small cup of warm tea and placed it on the table. "For you," the waiter said kindly. The girl looked surprised again. "Thank you," she said politely. She wrapped her hands around the cup for a moment, enjoying the warmth. Across the room, a few customers were still talking about the performance. "I've heard professional concerts that didn't feel that powerful," one person said. Another replied, "Maybe it wasn't just the music. Maybe it was the story behind it." The girl quietly sipped the tea while listening to the soft conversations around her. For the first time that evening, she seemed comfortable. The manager leaned back in his chair and looked toward the piano. "Do you think you'll keep playing?" he asked. The girl thought about the question. "I hope so," she said after a moment. Her voice carried a small hint of hope. The manager nodded slowly. "Music like that should not disappear," he said. At another table, the man who had apologized earlier stood up again and walked over. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. "You shouldn't have to walk the streets with talent like that." The girl didn't know what to say to that. The man continued speaking, but his tone was gentle. "I know someone who teaches music," he said. "A small school not far from here." The girl looked up with quiet curiosity. "They're always looking for people who love music," he added. The manager listened carefully as well. "That could be a good opportunity," the manager said thoughtfully. The girl remained silent for a moment. It was clear she wasn't used to people offering help. Life had probably taught her to expect very little from strangers. But something about the atmosphere in the restaurant tonight felt different. People were not laughing anymore. They were offering kindness. One of the customers nearby spoke up again. "Even if nothing happens tomorrow," the customer said, "tonight proved something." Everyone at the nearby tables looked toward the girl. "You have something special," the customer continued. The girl gave a small nod, but she didn't speak. Sometimes when someone has faced many difficult days, accepting praise feels almost as strange as hearing laughter. The manager eventually stood up. "Well," he said with a small smile, "the restaurant will close later tonight, but you are welcome to stay here for a while." The girl looked grateful. "Thank you," she said quietly. A few more customers finished their meals and slowly prepared to leave. As they passed by the table, several of them paused to speak to the girl. One person said, "Your music made my evening." Another said, "I hope you keep playing." Someone else simply nodded with a warm smile. Each small moment of kindness seemed to add a little more light to the girl's expression. After some time, the restaurant became calmer as the evening grew late. The manager walked toward the piano once more and gently touched the edge of it. Then he looked back at the girl. "You know," he said with a friendly tone, "that piano will still be here tomorrow." The girl looked at it again. Her eyes carried the same quiet connection to the instrument that people had noticed earlier. "Maybe I'll play again someday," she said. The manager smiled. "I hope you do." Outside the window, the street remained busy, but inside the restaurant the moment felt peaceful. What had started as a simple question for a piece of meal had turned into something much bigger. The girl eventually stood from the table and prepared to leave. Before walking toward the door, she paused for a moment near the piano. Her fingers gently touched the edge of the keys. Not to play, just to feel them for a second. Then she turned toward the door. Several people in the restaurant watched as she stepped outside into the cool night air. But this time she didn't walk away with the same tired expression she had carried earlier. She walked with something new. Hope. The people inside the restaurant slowly returned to their conversations, but many of them would remember that evening for a long time. They would remember the quiet girl who walked in asking, "Can I play for a piece of meal?" They would remember how laughter had filled the room at first. And they would remember how only a few minutes later, that same room had fallen completely silent, listening to music that no one expected. Because sometimes the greatest reminders in life arrive in the simplest moments. And sometimes the person everyone doubts at first turns out to be the one who leaves the strongest impression of all.